The Vicar's Drawing Room, St. Mary Mead, September 1952. The afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains of the vicarage drawing room had that particular golden quality that comes only in late September, when summer makes its final gracious bow before autumn claims the stage. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair by the window, her knitting needles clicking with the gentle rhythm of long practice, as she worked on what appeared to be a child's mitten in soft cream wool. To the casual observer she presented the very picture of elderly contentment, a pink-cheeked lady of advancing years, absorbed in her needlework and the pleasant ritual of afternoon tea. Those who knew Miss Marple better, however, understood that behind her mild blue eyes lay a mind as sharp as any detective's, honed by decades of observing human nature in all its infinite and often disturbing variety. "More tea, Miss Marple?" inquired Mrs. Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, hovering with the silver teapot. She was a handsome woman in her early 30s, with the kind of restless energy that suggested she found the pace of village life occasionally trying. "How very kind, my dear," Miss Marple replied, extending her delicate china cup. "Such a lovely gathering you've arranged, though I must confess I'm rather intrigued by this auction of yours. Candles, you said. It puts me very much in mind of old Mrs. Weatherby's collection. She had such a passion for unusual objects. It ended rather badly, I'm afraid." Griselda paused in her pouring, a slight frown creasing her brow. "Badly? Oh dear, I do hope you don't think—" "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, though her eyes had sharpened with interest. "It's simply that collections, particularly unusual ones, do tend to reveal so much about people's deeper inclinations, and where there are strong inclinations, there are often strong emotions." The occasion for this gathering was indeed unusual for St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Clement had organised what she termed a charity candle auction, in aid of the church restoration fund. The drawing room had been transformed for the purpose, with various candles displayed on occasional tables throughout the room. But it was the centrepiece that drew the eye, a magnificent tall candle of creamy beeswax, nearly 2 feet in height, standing on the mahogany side table like a pale sentinel. "The Midnight Vigil," Griselda explained, following Miss Marple's gaze. "It came from that rather exclusive shop in London, Lumina and Company. Frightfully expensive, but supposedly it burns for 36 hours without faltering. The description was quite dramatic. A candle to illuminate the darkest secrets and longest nights. Rather theatrical, but I thought it might appeal to our more sophisticated residents." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. 36 hours, she murmured thoughtfully. "That is indeed a very long time for anything to burn steadily. One wonders what sort of vigil would require such persistence." Before Griselda could respond, the drawing-room door opened to admit the first of the afternoon's bidders. Mrs. Lydia Armitage entered with the kind of self-possessed grace that spoke of London drawing-rooms and continental finishing schools. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, elegantly dressed in dove-grey silk that managed to be both understated and obviously expensive. Her dark hair was perfectly coiffed, and her intelligent hazel eyes took in the room's occupants with the swift, assessing glance of someone accustomed to evaluating both people and situations quickly. "Mrs. Clement, how delightful," she said, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of accent that might have been European, or might simply have been the product of expensive education. "I do hope I'm not too early. I confess myself quite curious about this auction of yours." "Not at all, Mrs. Armitage. Do come and see the collection. I think you'll find the centrepiece particularly interesting." As Mrs. Armitage moved toward the display, Miss Marple observed her with the same careful attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. There was something about the woman's composure that seemed almost too perfect, like a performance that had been rehearsed until it appeared natural. The drawing-room door opened again, admitting 2 more figures. The first was Mr. Hugh Denham, the new junior partner in old Mr. Petherick's law firm. He was a pleasant-looking man in his early 30s, with honest brown eyes and the slightly cautious manner of someone still establishing himself in a new community. Behind him came Miss Eleanor Trevelyan, Nell, as she insisted everyone call her, a young woman whose fashionable London clothes and carefully applied cosmetics seemed almost aggressively modern in the genteel atmosphere of the vicarage. "I say, what a curious collection," Denham remarked, approaching the candle display with genuine interest. "That large one is quite impressive. Is it actually meant to be burned, or is it purely decorative?" "Oh, it's meant to be burned," Nell Trevelyan said with a laugh that had a slight edge to it. "Though I can't imagine why anyone would want a candle that burns all night. Rather sinister, don't you think? Like something from a Gothic novel." Mrs. Armitage, who had been examining the midnight vigil candle with considerable interest, looked up at this comment. "I suppose that depends on one's perspective, Miss Trevelyan. Some of us find the idea of sustained illumination rather comforting." There was something in her tone, a subtle emphasis on the word sustained, that made Miss Marple's knitting needles slow their rhythm. She had heard that particular inflection before in the voices of people who were speaking about something other than what their words suggested. "Comforting, perhaps," Nell replied, "but also rather extravagant. Surely electric lighting is more practical these days." "Practicality," observed Hugh Denham with a slight smile, "is not always the primary consideration when it comes to atmosphere." Miss Marple noticed the brief glance that passed between him and Mrs. Armitage at these words, a look that seemed to carry more meaning than the casual conversation warranted. The afternoon proceeded with the gentle ritual of village social gatherings. More guests arrived. Major Burnaby, with his military bearing and tendency toward blunt observations, Mrs. Price Ridley, the banker's wife, whose curiosity about her neighbours' affairs was legendary, young Dr. Haydock, recently returned from London to take over his father's practice, and several other pillars of St. Mary Mead society. Miss Marple remained in her corner, her knitting growing steadily longer, as she observed the subtle interplay of personalities around the candle display. She noticed how Mrs. Armitage seemed to position herself so that she could observe the other guests without being directly observed herself. She saw how Nell Trevelyan's bright chatter became slightly forced whenever Hugh Denham spoke directly to Mrs. Armitage. She observed the way Dr. Haydock's professional eye seemed to linger on Mrs. Armitage's hands, which showed a slight tremor when she thought no one was looking. Most intriguingly, she noticed how each of the main participants seemed drawn repeatedly to the midnight vigil candle, as if it held some particular fascination beyond its obvious beauty and unusual properties. The auction itself was conducted with the quiet efficiency typical of such village affairs. Griselda read out the descriptions of each candle, and guests wrote their bids on small cards provided for the purpose. There was polite murmuring over the various offerings: hand-dipped tapers, scented pillars, decorative floating candles. But the real interest, as everyone had anticipated, centered on the magnificent centerpiece. "And finally," Griselda announced, "lot number 12, the midnight vigil candle. As I mentioned, it's guaranteed to burn for 36 hours without interruption. The bidding starts at 5 shillings. Miss Marple watched with keen interest as several hands moved to write on their bid cards. Mrs. Armitage wrote something quickly, then seemed to reconsider and crossed it out before writing again. Nell Trevelyan hesitated for a long moment before making her bid, her pretty face unusually serious. Hugh Denham wrote his bid with the careful deliberation of a lawyer, but Miss Marple noticed that his eyes were not on his card, but on Mrs. Armitage. When the bids were collected and sorted, Griselda's eyebrows rose slightly. "My goodness, we have been generous. The winning bid for the midnight vigil candle is 15 shillings, submitted by Mrs. Armitage." There was a small rustle of surprise from the assembled guests. 15 shillings was a considerable sum for a candle, however. Special. Mrs. Armitage accepted the congratulations of her neighbours with gracious composure, But Miss Marple noticed that her hands were no longer quite steady as she reached for her purse. "A most generous contribution to the Restoration Fund," the vicar said warmly as he presented Mrs. Armitage with her prize. "I do hope it serves you well during those long autumn evenings." "I'm sure it will serve its purpose admirably," Mrs. Armitage replied, cradling the tall candle carefully in her arms. After all, some vigils are worth maintaining regardless of the cost. As the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple made her quiet farewells and prepared to return to her cottage. But as she reached the vicarage gate, she paused and looked back. Through the drawing-room window she could see Mrs. Armitage still standing by the mahogany table, the midnight vigil candle held against her chest like a talisman. Even from this distance, Miss Marple could see that the woman's composed facade had slipped, revealing an expression of what looked remarkably like fear. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured to herself as she walked slowly down the lane toward her cottage. A candle that burns for 36 hours, purchased by a woman who appears to be keeping secrets, and desired by several others who also seem to have complications in their lives. She paused at her own gate, her mild blue eyes thoughtful. In her long experience, she had learned that when people fought over objects with symbolic significance, whether it was a piece of jewelry, a family portrait, or even a candle, the real battle was rarely about the object itself. It was about what that object represented: power, secrets, or sometimes simply the difference between safety and exposure. As she prepared for bed that evening, Miss Marple found herself thinking about vigils, those long, patient watchings that people maintain for various reasons. Some vigils were kept in hope, others in fear. Some were maintained to honor the dead, others to protect the living. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was about to begin a vigil of an entirely different sort, one that might well end in tragedy. For in her experience, when people spoke of illuminating secrets and maintaining long watches, murder was seldom far behind. The news reached Miss Marple as such tidings invariably did in St. Mary Mead, through the efficient network of domestic servants who formed the village's true intelligence service. She had just finished her morning correspondence when Florence, her faithful maid of 20 years, appeared in the doorway with the particular expression that announced drama. "Begging your pardon, miss, but there's been trouble at Ivy Cottage," Florence announced, her voice carrying that blend of distress and excitement that accompanies shocking news. "Mrs. Armitage has been found dead." Miss Marple set down her fountain pen with deliberate care. "Dead? When was she discovered?" "This morning at 8 o'clock, miss. Mrs. Butt, her daily woman, found the front door standing wide open when she arrived for work. Most unusual, as Mrs. Armitage was always particular about security." Mrs. Butt called out, got no answer, and went up to the study. There she was, sitting in her chair by the desk, quite peaceful-like, but stone dead. Before Miss Marple could respond, the rapid footsteps of Mrs. Price Ridley could be heard approaching the front door. Within moments that lady had burst into the sitting room, her face flushed with the importance of bearing momentous news. "Jane, my dear, have you heard about poor Mrs. Armitage? Found dead this morning with that enormous candle from yesterday's auction burned right down beside her. Dr. Haydock has been called, and Inspector Craddock is driving over from Much Benham this very minute." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythmic clicking. "The candle was burned down, you say? How much of it remained?" According to Mrs. Butt, it had burned about a third of the way down, perhaps 8 or 9 inches, still flickering when she found it, casting the most eerie shadows about the room. The poor woman was quite beside herself. Miss Marple's mind began its careful calculations. A 36-hour candle, approximately 24 inches in height, burning at roughly 2/3 of an inch per hour. 8 inches consumed would represent roughly 12 hours of burning. If Mrs. Armitage had lit it after returning from the auction, say around 7 o'clock the previous evening, it would have burned until approximately 7 this morning, just 1 hour before Mrs. Butt's arrival. "Most precise timing," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to her visitor. I beg your pardon, dear. Nothing of consequence, Martha. Tell me, was there any sign of disturbance? Any indication that Mrs. Armitage had been expecting visitors? Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward conspiratorially. That's the curious thing. Mrs. Butt mentioned that the kitchen door was unlatched, most unlike Mrs. Armitage, and there were 2 teacups on the tray in the drawing room, though only one had been used. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple's nephew, whose grim expression suggested the morning had brought more questions than answers. After greeting his aunt with genuine affection, he accepted her offer of tea and settled into the comfortable chair that she always kept ready for unexpected visitors. I suppose the village telegraph has been working overtime, he observed wryly. Yes, Mrs. Armitage is dead. Dr. Haydock believes it was heart failure, possibly brought on by shock or emotional strain. There are no obvious signs of violence, but something about the scene troubles me. The candle? Miss Marple suggested gently. Craddock nodded. Among other things. She was found sitting upright in her study chair, fully dressed despite the early hour, with that large beeswax candle burning on the desk before her. A book of poetry lay open in her lap, Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. The whole arrangement seemed almost staged. Staged for whom, I wonder? Miss Marple mused. A woman doesn't maintain a 12-hour vigil by candlelight without purpose. She was waiting for someone, or watching for something. As if summoned by her words, Hugh Denham appeared at the garden gate, his usually composed demeanour notably strained. When Florence showed him in, Miss Marple observed that his hands were trembling slightly, and his tie was askew, details that spoke of a man under considerable stress. Inspector Craddock, he began without preamble, I believe I may have information relevant to Mrs. Armitage's death. She came to see me yesterday evening after the auction. She was frightened, genuinely frightened, and asked me to witness her signature on a document. She said she expected an unwelcome visitor during the night and wanted to ensure her affairs were in order. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, but her eyes had sharpened with interest. A vigil then, but not one of hope. Mrs. Armitage had been keeping watch against something she feared was coming. Inspector Craddock leaned forward intently. What sort of document, Mr. Denham? Hugh shifted uncomfortably, his professional discretion warring with civic duty. A codicil to her will. She arrived at my cottage just after 9 o'clock, carrying a typed document and insisting it be witnessed immediately. She was quite agitated, kept glancing at her watch and mentioning that she had very little time before the reckoning, as she put it. Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. A codicil suggests she wished to alter her previous arrangements. Was the change significant? Quite substantial, Hugh admitted reluctantly. She left a legacy of £500 to Miss Trevelyan with a rather curious notation. In recognition of a debt long overdue and a wrong which I failed to prevent. She also made provisions for certain personal effects to be delivered directly to Miss Trevelyan, bypassing the usual probate procedures. Craddock's eyebrows rose. Miss Trevelyan? I had the impression they were barely acquainted. That was my understanding as well, Hugh replied. When I expressed surprise, Mrs. Armitage became quite emotional. She said that sometimes the people we know least are those we owe the most, and that she had carried the burden of silence too long. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with renewed interest. How very illuminating. Did she specify the nature of this debt or wrong? She began to explain, then stopped abruptly, as if she had heard something outside. She went to the window, peered through the curtains, then returned looking even more distressed. Not yet, she said. First I must survive the vigil. If I'm still here when that candle burns down, then perhaps it will be safe to tell the whole truth. Before Craddock could respond, the sound of animated conversation drifted through the open window. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice carried clearly across the garden. Mark my words, there's more to this than meets the eye. Foreign candles, mysterious legacies. It's like something from a sensation novel. The inspector sighed. I suppose the entire village knows about the will by now? Miss Marple smiled gently. News travels with remarkable efficiency in St. Mary Mead. By this afternoon, I suspect everyone will have their own theory about Mrs. Armitage's death. The grocer's wife has already declared it was nerves and too much reading, while Major Burnaby insists it was delayed shock from the war. Mrs. Clement, however, mentioned something rather more interesting. She set down her knitting and moved to the window, observing the small clusters of villagers engaged in earnest discussion along the lane. Griselda noticed that during the auction, Mrs. Armitage and Miss Trevelyan had what appeared to be a rather intense private conversation. According to her, Miss Trevelyan seemed to be arguing some point quite forcefully, and Mrs. Armitage's expression grew increasingly determined. Hugh nodded slowly. That would explain her urgency about the codicil. Perhaps Miss Trevelyan had already approached her about this debt, or wrong she mentioned. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she found the explanation incomplete. Though one wonders why Miss Trevelyan would argue against receiving a legacy, if indeed that was the subject of their discussion. As if summoned by their conversation, Nell Trevelyan appeared at the garden gate, her usually immaculate appearance notably dishevelled. Her green dress was wrinkled, her hair slightly awry, and her eyes showed clear signs of distress. Miss Marple, she called out, her voice carrying a note of desperation. Might I have a word? I find myself in rather difficult circumstances, and I'm not sure who else to turn to. When Florence showed her into the sitting room, Miss Marple observed that the young woman's hands were trembling slightly, and she kept glancing toward the window as if expecting to see someone approaching. It's about Mrs. Armitage, Nell began without preamble. The people are saying terrible things, that I somehow influenced her, that I knew about this legacy she's left me. But I swear to you I knew nothing about it until Mr. Denham told me this morning. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the careful phrasing. But you did speak with her yesterday, did you not? At the auction? Nell's composure cracked slightly. Yes, but it wasn't about money. She said she knew who I really was, and that she intended to make amends. I told her she was mistaken, that I had no idea what she meant, but she just smiled and said the truth had a way of surfacing like cream and milk. Inspector Craddock exchanged a meaningful glance with his aunt. In his experience, when people spoke of making amends and knowing someone's true identity, murder was seldom far behind. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was already working through the implications. A woman keeping a midnight vigil, a legacy to someone she barely knew, and a young woman who protested perhaps too much about her innocence. In her long experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those that people claimed not to possess. The afternoon brought Dr. Haydock to Miss Marple's cottage, his usually cheerful demeanour replaced by professional concern. He accepted a cup of tea with absent gratitude, his mind clearly occupied by the morning's examination. I've completed my preliminary assessment of Mrs. Armitage, he told Inspector Craddock, settling into the chair by the window. The initial appearance suggested heart failure, but there are several troubling inconsistencies. Her pupils were unusually dilated, and there was a faint medicinal odour about her person, something sweet and cloying that I cannot quite identify. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. Was there any indication she had taken medication that evening, Doctor? That's precisely what concerns me, Haydock replied. On her desk beside that enormous candle I found a distinctive teacup, Meissen porcelain with an elaborate rose pattern. It contained perhaps a quarter-inch of cold tea, and the rim showed traces of a crystalline residue. I've sent samples for analysis, though I'm not entirely certain what we're looking for. Inspector Craddock made careful notes. Mrs. Butt mentioned seeing 2 teacups in the drawing room, though only one appeared to have been used. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Armitage was expecting a visitor and prepared her finest china for the occasion. People often do that when they wish to maintain dignity during difficult circumstances, though one wonders whether the visitor arrived as expected. Dr. Hedek nodded thoughtfully. The scene itself was curiously arranged. Everything in the study showed almost obsessive precision. Books aligned perfectly, papers squared on the desk, even that massive candle positioned exactly in the center of its silver holder. The only disruption was a small jewelry box that had been knocked to the floor, its contents scattered across the Persian rug. This detail captured Miss Marple's complete attention. What sort of contents, if I may ask? Nothing of great monetary value, according to Mrs. Butt. Some old-fashioned jewelry, a few brooches, a locket, but there was also a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, and these Mrs. Armitage had apparently been reading when death overtook her. The handwriting was educated but showed signs of emotional distress, full of references to shared burdens and truths that must surface. Most significantly, they were signed only with the initials E.T. Before Inspector Craddock could respond to this revelation, Major Burnaby appeared at the garden gate with his customary directness. When Florence had shown him in, he wasted no time on pleasantries. "Heard you were gathering information about last night, Inspector. Thought you should know I saw Mrs. Armitage around 10:30 during my evening walk. Lights were burning in both her study and drawing room, which struck me as unusual. She was typically quite economical with electricity. Earlier, around 9 o'clock, I distinctly observed young Denham leaving her cottage. Seemed in considerable haste, kept glancing back as if checking whether anyone had noticed him." Hugh, who had remained quietly thoughtful throughout these revelations, cleared his throat. "As I've explained, Mrs. Armitage summoned me to witness her codicil. But she did mention expecting one final visitor before the night was through, and said this person would determine whether she lived to see morning. I assumed she was being dramatic, but now—" The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Fletcher's arrival, his face flushed with the importance of discovery. "Sir, we've found something significant in the garden at Ivy Cottage, buried in the flower bed directly beneath the study window." He produced a soil-stained object wrapped in his handkerchief. Craddock carefully unfolded the cloth to reveal a tarnished silver locket, dented as if it had been dropped with force. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman bearing a striking resemblance to Nell Trevelyan, and opposite it, a lock of dark hair. The initials E.T. were engraved on the back. "We also found footprints in the soft earth," Fletcher reported. "A woman's shoe, size 5, with a distinctive heel pattern that matches Miss Trevelyan's current footwear." When summoned to explain this evidence, Nell arrived with her composure visibly shaken. Her hands trembled as she examined the locket, and tears welled in her eyes. "I did go to the cottage last night," she whispered, "but I swear I didn't enter the house. I wanted to speak with Mrs. Armitage again, to understand what she meant about knowing my true identity. But when I reached the window and saw her sitting there with that candle burning, she looked so intense, so frightening, as if she were waiting for something terrible to happen. I lost my nerve and ran. I must have dropped the locket then." Miss Marple accepted the locket for examination, studying both the photograph and the worn silver with careful attention. "This appears to be quite old, my dear. The photograph shows a woman dressed in the fashion of the early 1930s. Is this your mother?" Nell nodded miserably. "She died when I was very young. It's the only picture I have of her." Inspector Craddock's expression had grown increasingly stern. "Miss Trevelyan, you've now admitted to being at the scene during the crucial hours. Can you account for the time between your visit to the cottage and your return to Mrs. Larcher's establishment?" "I walked about the village for perhaps an hour," she replied desperately. "I was too agitated to sleep immediately, but I spoke to no one. It was past 11 o'clock. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to a detail that had been troubling her since Dr. Haydock's report. she interrupted gently. Doctor, you mentioned that the candle had burned completely down by the time you arrived, but surely that presents a mathematical impossibility? Haydock frowned. How do you mean? A 36-hour candle of that size, approximately 24 inches in height, should burn at roughly 2/3 of an inch per hour. If Mrs. Armitage lit it upon returning from the auction, say at 7 o'clock yesterday evening, it should have consumed only 8 or 9 inches by 8 this morning. Yet you say it had burned entirely away. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. A candle that burned twice as fast as intended suggested deliberate tampering, perhaps a larger wick or wax mixed with accelerant. Someone had wanted that vigil to end sooner than Mrs. Armitage had planned. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was working with increased urgency. A woman keeping watch by candlelight, letters from someone signing themselves E.T., a locket dropped in panic, and physical evidence suggesting the victim's careful preparations had been sabotaged. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the final picture remained obscured. In her long experience, she had learned that the most dangerous murders were those that appeared to be natural deaths, and the most successful murderers were those who understood their victims' fears well enough to use them as weapons. The morning brought Inspector Craddock to Miss Marple's cottage with laboratory results that transformed speculation into grim certainty. Dr. Haydock accompanied him, his usually cheerful demeanour replaced by professional gravity as they settled into the familiar chairs by the window. The analysis confirms our suspicions, Craddock announced without preamble. Mrs. Armitage was murdered. The tea residue contained a lethal concentration of digitalin, far exceeding any therapeutic dose. More significantly, examination of the candle remains revealed deliberate tampering. Someone had drilled a narrow hole down the centre and filled it with saltpeter and lamp oil, causing it to burn at nearly double the intended rate. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed this information. So our murderer understood both Mrs. Armitage's medical vulnerabilities and her psychological state. The candle was meant to create a false sense of security. She believed she had 36 hours of safety, when in reality she had barely 18. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The digitalin would have taken effect within hours of consumption. Combined with her existing heart condition, death would have appeared entirely natural. Without your observation about the candle's burn rate, we might never have suspected foul play. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Clement, whose face showed the particular excitement that accompanies the bearer of significant news. Inspector, I've had the most extraordinary visitor, a Mrs. Helena Forsyth from London. She claims to be Mrs. Armitage's sister, and says she has crucial information about the case. Within the hour, Mrs. Forsyth sat in Miss Marple's drawing room, a dignified woman in morning dress whose composed exterior barely concealed deep emotion. Lydia and I had not spoken in 20 years, she began, her voice carefully controlled. We quarrelled over a matter of conscience, involving a young woman named Eleanor Trevelyan, Miss Nell's mother. The story that emerged cast Mrs. Armitage's recent behaviour in an entirely new light. Eleanor Trevelyan had been governess to a wealthy London family in the early 1930s, where she had encountered Mrs. Armitage, then employed as companion to the family's elderly aunt. When the family's eldest son made inappropriate advances toward Eleanor, and she rejected them, he accused her of theft to preserve his reputation. Lydia witnessed the true events, but remained silent to protect her position, Mrs. Forsyth continued, her hands trembling slightly. Eleanor was dismissed without references, died destitute in childbirth, and her daughter was placed in an orphanage. When I learned of this tragedy, I confronted Lydia with her cowardice. She claimed fear for her livelihood, but I could not forgive such moral weakness. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was working rapidly through the implications. And Mrs. Armitage recently discovered that our Miss Trevelyan was Eleanor's daughter. 3 weeks ago, according to her letter to me. The resemblance was unmistakable once she looked closely. Lydia was consumed with guilt and determined to make restitution, but she feared Nell might seek vengeance rather than accept her apology. The revelation explained much about Mrs. Armitage's behaviour, her urgent codicil, her midnight vigil, her references to debts long overdue. But it also raised disturbing questions about who else might have known this history and seen opportunity in Mrs. Armitage's guilt. These questions gained urgency when Sergeant Fletcher arrived with news of a second suspect. Mrs. Price Ridley had been discovered rifling through papers in the church vestry, searching for what she claimed were missing charity funds. Under questioning, she admitted to confronting Mrs. Armitage about discrepancies in the Restoration Fund accounts. "I told her she couldn't hide it forever," Mrs. Price Ridley confessed reluctantly. "There were irregularities going back months. I suspected she was borrowing from the fund to cover some personal crisis. When I went to her cottage to demand an explanation, I may have examined her sideboard while looking for evidence." Dr. Haydock's professional interest sharpened. "Mrs. Price Ridley, do you have any knowledge of heart medications or their effects?" "My late husband suffered from cardiac problems," she replied defensively. "I'm familiar with digitalin and its proper dosages, but I would never, financial irregularities are hardly grounds for murder." Yet her admission provided both opportunity and motive. Access to the candle cabinet, knowledge of heart medications, and a financial scandal that Mrs. Armitage might have been desperate to conceal. Miss Marple observed the woman carefully, noting the genuine distress beneath her bluster. Mrs. Price Ridley was certainly capable of moral compromise, but murder required a different sort of constitution entirely. As the afternoon wore on and the various suspects were questioned, Miss Marple found herself returning to the technical aspects of the crime. The candle tampering required both chemical knowledge and careful planning. The digital poisoning demonstrated understanding of medical interactions. Most significantly, the murderer had known about Mrs. Armitage's vigil in advance and understood its symbolic importance to her psychological state. She excused herself as evening approached, ostensibly to tend her garden, but actually to visit the churchyard where Eleanor Trevelyan lay buried. The simple headstone bore only the dates 1910-1934, and the inscription, "Her light was brief but bright." Standing there in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the long shadows that past injustices cast across present lives. Someone had used Mrs. Armitage's guilt as a weapon against her, transforming her desire for redemption into the very mechanism of her death. The candle that was meant to provide comfort during her vigil had been turned into a timer for murder, while the tea that should have sustained her through the long night had carried poison instead. Returning home, Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting and began to organize her thoughts with characteristic methodical precision. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous murderers were those who understood their victims' fears intimately enough to exploit them. In this case, someone had known not only Mrs. Armitage's medical vulnerabilities and guilty secrets, but also her desperate need to make amends for past failures. The question now was not whether Mrs. Armitage had been murdered, but which of her various burdens, guilt, fear, financial desperation, or simply the misfortune of possessing dangerous knowledge, had ultimately proved fatal. In Miss Marple's experience, the answer usually lay not in the obvious motives, but in the hidden connections that bound seemingly separate lives together in patterns of obligation, resentment, and long-deferred reckoning. The morning brought Inspector Craddock to Miss Marple's cottage with news that transformed the investigation from a simple case of village secrets into something far more complex. His expression carried the particular gravity that comes when a straightforward inquiry reveals layers of deception beneath its surface. "We've discovered that Mrs. Armitage was being blackmailed," he announced without preamble, settling into the familiar chair by the window. Hugh Denham found a sealed letter among her papers, One she instructed him to open only if she died under suspicious circumstances. The contents make for disturbing reading. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm. Blackmail would certainly explain her recent financial difficulties and her sense of urgency about making amends. What form did this extortion take? Anonymous letters demanding £500, the exact sum she left to Miss Trevelyan in her codicil. The blackmailer claimed that her silence during the Eleanor Trevelyan affair made her complicit in the young woman's death. Mrs. Armitage had been desperately trying to raise the funds without arousing suspicion. This revelation cast Mrs. Price Ridley's observations about the charity fund in an entirely new light. Mrs. Armitage hadn't been embezzling, she'd been frantically attempting to gather money to silence someone who knew her most shameful secret. Before they could explore this development further, Nell Trevelyan appeared at the garden gate, her usual fashionable composure replaced by something harder and more determined. When Florence showed her in, she addressed them with unexpected directness. "I understand there's been talk about blackmail," she began, her voice steady despite the strain evident in her features. "I should clarify my own position before rumours take hold. I came to St. Mary Mead deliberately, seeking the woman who destroyed my mother's life." Miss Marple observed the young woman carefully, noting the fierce pride beneath her distress. "You were not adopted as an infant then?" "No. I was placed with a merchant family at age 8. Good people who gave me education and opportunities my mother never had. But they also gave me the resources to research the scandal that killed her. It took years to identify Lydia Armitage as the companion who remained silent when my mother needed her most." Inspector Craddock leaned forward intently. "Miss Trevelyan, did you send the anonymous letters demanding payment?" Nell's laugh held genuine surprise. "I wanted justice, not money. I confronted Mrs. Armitage directly 3 weeks ago, told her exactly who I was and what her cowardice had cost. I wanted her to suffer the knowledge of what she'd done, to live with guilt as my mother had lived with poverty and shame. Anonymous accusations would have been pointless. She needed to see my mother's face in mine." The revelation left them with a troubling conclusion. If Nell wasn't the blackmailer, then someone else had discovered Mrs. Armitage's secret and exploited it for financial gain. Someone who possessed intimate knowledge of a 20-year-old scandal and understood both Mrs. Armitage's psychological vulnerabilities and her current circumstances. Their deliberations were interrupted by Sergeant Fletcher's arrival, his face showing the satisfaction of significant discovery. "We found something important in the church hall rubbish bin, sir. A small glass vial, quite old by the look of it, with traces of what appears to be a medicine label." Dr. Haydock examined the bottle carefully, noting its age and the careful removal of identifying marks. However, under strong light, faint traces of writing remained visible. Miss Marple, peering through her reading glasses, deciphered the fragmented letters. "Ondon Apothecary, 193. This bottle dates from the early 1930s, she observed thoughtfully. "The same period as Eleanor Trevelyan's tragedy. It suggests our murderer has been carrying this poison, or at least the means to prepare it, for 20 years. As the afternoon progressed, additional evidence emerged that complicated the picture further. A search of the church hall storage areas revealed a book on domestic chemistry with several pages torn out, pages dealing specifically with combustible materials and their effects on candle wax. The discovery confirmed that someone had researched the technical aspects of tampering with the midnight vigil candle. Meanwhile, Hugh Denham's financial irregularities came to light under police questioning. His investment of Mrs. Armitage's funds without authorization provided both motive and opportunity, though his telephone records appeared to support his alibi for the crucial hours. Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by the timing of various revelations. Mrs. Armitage had discovered Nell's identity 3 weeks earlier, precisely when the blackmail letters began arriving. Yet Nell's direct approach suggested she wasn't the anonymous correspondent. Someone else had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit Mrs. Armitage's newfound guilt. As evening approached, she sat in her garden reflecting on the pattern that was emerging. A woman keeping a midnight vigil, multiple people with reasons to wish her silenced, and a killer who understood that guilt could be as lethal as any poison. The candle that was meant to provide comfort during her long watch had been turned into a timer for murder, while the tea that should have sustained her through the night had carried death instead. Most significantly, the murderer had possessed both the chemical knowledge to tamper with the candle and access to a poison that had been prepared decades earlier. This suggested someone with connections to the original Eleanor Trevelyan scandal, someone who had been carrying the means of murder for 20 years, waiting for the right moment and the right victim. In her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous murderers were those who understood their victims' fears intimately enough to exploit them. Someone in St. Mary Mead had watched Mrs. Armitage's growing guilt and desperation, had seen opportunity in her desire for redemption, and had used her own conscience as the weapon that destroyed her. The question now was not simply who had killed Mrs. Armitage, but who among the suspects possessed both the patience to wait 2 decades for revenge and the cold calculation to turn a symbol of hope into an instrument of death. The following morning brought Mrs. Clement to Miss Marple's cottage with a discovery that cast the investigation in an entirely new light. She carried a small leather-bound diary, her usual composure noticeably shaken as she settled into the familiar chair by the window. "I found this while sorting donations for the church jumble sale," she explained, her voice tight with concern. It was tucked inside a box of old hymnals that Mrs. Price Ridley contributed. The handwriting caught my attention immediately. It's remarkably similar to those anonymous letters that were sent to Mrs. Armitage. Miss Marple accepted the volume with careful attention, her needles pausing as she examined the faded entries. The diary belonged to a young woman working as a companion in London during the early 1930s, and the perspective it revealed was far from sympathetic. The writer expressed bitter jealousy toward that Trevelyan girl, describing Eleanor as manipulative and suggesting she had brought her troubles upon herself. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured, turning the pages with delicate precision. "It appears Mrs. Price Ridley knew Eleanor Trevelyan personally and harboured considerable resentment. She writes here of Eleanor's airs and graces and suggests she was getting above her station. The tone is quite venomous, I'm afraid." Inspector Craddock, who had arrived shortly after Mrs. Clement, studied the diary with growing interest. This establishes a direct connection between Mrs. Price Ridley and the original scandal. She wasn't simply investigating church funds, she had intimate knowledge of the events that destroyed Eleanor Trevelyan. When confronted at the vicarage that afternoon, Mrs. Price Ridley's customary bluster collapsed entirely. She admitted, with visible reluctance, to having worked in the same London household as both Eleanor Trevelyan and Lydia Armitage, though she had carefully concealed this connection since arriving in St. Mary Mead. "I may have been unkind in my assessment of Eleanor," she confessed, her hands trembling as she spoke. "She was beautiful and accomplished, and everyone in the household admired her. When the scandal broke, I perhaps encouraged the family to doubt her character. I told Lydia it was safer to remain silent and protect our positions." Miss Marple observed the woman carefully, noting how 20 years of buried guilt had manifested in her obsessive concern with others' moral failings. "And when you discovered that Mrs. Armitage intended to make restitution to Eleanor's daughter, you saw an opportunity to profit from your shared secret?" Mrs. Price Ridley's face flushed crimson. "I needed the money desperately. My husband's investments had failed, and we were facing financial ruin. I thought if Lydia could afford to give away £500 to ease her conscience, she could spare the same amount to ensure my silence." This revelation provided both motive and means for the blackmail, but Inspector Craddock's investigation had uncovered additional complications. A search of Hugh Denham's office had revealed a receipt from a London chemist for potassium nitrate and lamp oil, the exact substances used to tamper with the midnight vigil candle. Hugh's explanation, when pressed, was immediate and detailed. I purchased those materials for old Mr. Thompson, who creates fireworks for the village celebrations. You can verify this with him directly. I had no idea they could be used for other purposes. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Did anyone else know about this purchase, Mr. Denham? My office is generally unlocked during business hours, he admitted reluctantly. And I may have mentioned the errand to Miss Trevelyan when we met for lunch that day. She was asking about chemical reactions, said she was researching stain removal for vintage fabrics. This detail brought Nell Trevelyan's technical knowledge into sharp focus. Her interest in chemistry, combined with her admitted desire for justice, suggested she possessed both the means and motivation for the elaborate murder method. Yet something in her direct manner struck Miss Marple as inconsistent with the psychological complexity of the crime. As evening approached, a new development shattered the village's uneasy calm. Fire broke out in the church vestry, destroying the financial records Mrs. Price Ridley had been investigating. Though quickly extinguished by the volunteer brigade, the blaze had consumed evidence that might have proven or disproven the embezzlement theories. Standing in her garden, watching smoke rise against the darkening sky, Miss Marple felt a familiar certainty that she was witnessing a performance designed to misdirect. The fire was too convenient, the timing too perfect. Someone was manipulating events with the precision of a chess master, using each character's weaknesses against them. Dr. Haydock arrived as the last of the fire brigade departed, his face grave with new information. I've been reviewing the technical aspects of the murder, he told Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock. The candle tampering required specific knowledge, not just of chemistry, but of Mrs. Armitage's psychological state. The killer understood that she would light that particular candle for her vigil and knew exactly how long it needed to burn to create the desired effect. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her mind was working with increased urgency. The murderer possessed intimate knowledge of several people's secrets and fears. Mrs. Armitage's guilt about Eleanor Trevelyan, Mrs. Price Ridley's financial desperation, even Nell's desire for justice. Someone has been watching and waiting, using each person's character against them. She paused, her mild blue eyes thoughtful. In my experience, the most dangerous criminals are those who understand human nature well enough to predict exactly how their victims will behave. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation, it was a carefully orchestrated performance, with each player moving precisely as the director intended. As the investigation continued into the night, Miss Marple found herself returning to a troubling realization. The evidence pointed in multiple directions, but the psychological pattern suggested a single, calculating intelligence behind it all. Someone who had been present at every crucial moment, observing without being observed, guiding discoveries and conversations with subtle precision. The key lay not in who had the strongest motive, but in who possessed the clearest understanding of how everyone else would react. The murderer was someone who treated people like chess pieces, moving them into positions where their own flaws and fears would serve as weapons against each other. In her long experience with human wickedness, Miss Marple had learned to recognize this particular type of criminal mind, one that found satisfaction not just in achieving its goals, but in watching others destroy themselves in the process. Such people were often the most dangerous because they remained invisible, hiding behind the chaos they created, while others took the blame for their carefully orchestrated destruction. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected that tomorrow would likely bring the final pieces of the puzzle into focus. The murderer had been patient for 20 years, but the elaborate nature of this crime suggested someone who could no longer resist the temptation to display their cleverness. In her experience, that moment of pride often proved to be a killer's ultimate undoing. The morning brought Dr. Haydock to Miss Marple's cottage with information that transformed their understanding of the crime's technical sophistication. He settled into the familiar chair by the window, his expression carrying the weight of significant discovery. "I've been consulting with my father about the digital and poisoning," he began, accepting tea with distracted gratitude. The concentration found in Mrs. Armitage's teacup indicates pharmaceutical preparation rather than crude plant extraction. Such refined preparations were common in medical practice during the early 1930s, but have since been largely replaced by standardized formulations. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused with interest. "You're suggesting the poison came from old medical supplies rather than fresh preparation." "Precisely. My father recalls prescribing such concentrated digitalin solutions for cardiac patients in London during that period. The preparation required specific knowledge of dosage calculations and chemical interactions, knowledge that would have been possessed by physicians, their assistants, or anyone with access to their dispensaries. This revelation cast the investigation in an entirely new light. The murderer possessed not only intimate knowledge of Mrs. Armitage's psychological state, but also access to sophisticated pharmaceutical preparations that had been stored for decades. Before they could explore this development further, Inspector Craddock arrived with news that someone had attempted to break into Ivy Cottage during the night. Fresh pry marks on the study window suggested a desperate search for something the murderer believed had been overlooked. Whatever they were seeking, they didn't find it through the window, Craddock reported. But Mrs. Butt noticed that a small framed photograph had been removed from the mantelpiece, one she distinctly remembered seeing when she discovered the body. Miss Marple resumed her knitting thoughtfully. A photograph significant enough to risk a second visit to the scene. Someone whose connection to Mrs. Armitage could not bear scrutiny. Their discussion was interrupted by Hugh Denham's unexpected arrival, his usual professional composure notably strained. He carried a sealed envelope which he placed on the table with trembling hands. "Mrs. Armitage gave me this with strict instructions to open it only if she died under suspicious circumstances," he explained. "Inside is a confession, not of murder, but of a different sort of crime. She details her silence during Eleanor Trevelyan's disgrace, and names everyone else who was present during those events. The document that emerged painted a complex picture of the original scandal. Besides Mrs. Armitage and Mrs. Price Ridley, there had been others in the household who witnessed the truth but remained silent. Most significantly, the confession mentioned a young woman named Grace Clement, a distant relative of the family who had been visiting during Eleanor's employment." Miss Marple's needles clicked with sudden intensity. Grace Clement. How very interesting. And this young woman would be approximately what age now? Hugh consulted the document carefully. If she was 15 or 16 in 1932, she would be in her mid-30s today. The confession notes that she was particularly vindictive toward Eleanor, claiming the governess had put on airs and deserved her downfall. The implications were staggering. Griselda Clement had never mentioned any connection to the Trevelyan scandal, yet if Hugh's information was accurate, she had been present during the original events and had actively supported Eleanor's persecution. As afternoon approached, Miss Marple decided upon a delicate experiment in human psychology. She arranged for what appeared to be a casual tea gathering at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming harvest festival. Among the guests were Mrs. Clement, Nell Trevelyan, and Mrs. Forsyth. Miss Marple arrived carrying a distinctive beeswax candle, smaller than the midnight vigil, but unmistakably similar in appearance. As she placed it on the tea table, she observed the reactions carefully. "I thought this might be appropriate for our discussion of the harvest decorations," she said gently, lighting the candle with deliberate ceremony. "Candles have such symbolic power, don't they? They represent hope, vigil, remembrance. Mrs. Armitage understood that, I believe." Nell Trevelyan looked away, clearly distressed. Mrs. Forsyth dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, but Griselda Clement watched the flame with an expression that was neither grief nor discomfort. It was fascination, almost hunger, as if she were watching a performance she had choreographed herself. Such a tragic loss, Griselda murmured, though her tone lacked genuine sorrow. Poor Lydia, keeping her vigil with that enormous candle. One wonders what she hoped to accomplish by burning it through the night. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes sharpened. Indeed, though I understand from Mrs. Forsyth that you and Mrs. Armitage often exchanged herbal remedies and tea recipes, such knowledge can be quite potent in the wrong hands. For just a moment Griselda's composed mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Miss Marple. Simply that those who understand the healing properties of plants often understand their more dangerous applications as well. Foxgloves, for instance, so beautiful in a garden, yet containing such powerful cardiac stimulants. The tension in the room became palpable. Griselda's hands, Miss Marple noticed, had begun to tremble slightly, not with fear but with what appeared to be suppressed excitement, as if she were enjoying a game whose rules only she fully understood. As the gathering concluded and guests began to depart, Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to help clear the tea things. But her real purpose was to observe Griselda's behaviour when she believed herself unwatched. The vicar's wife moved about the room with unusual energy, her eyes bright and alert. When she thought no one was looking, she paused beside the still burning candle, watching the flame with that same intense fascination Miss Marple had noted earlier. Beautiful, isn't it? Miss Marple said softly, causing Griselda to start. The way candlelight reveals things that daylight keeps hidden. Mrs. Armitage discovered that, I believe, during her final hours. Griselda's smile was perfectly composed, but her eyes held a glitter that spoke of dangerous intelligence. Some secrets are better left in darkness, don't you think, Miss Marple? Digging up the past can be such a hazardous occupation. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the pattern that was finally becoming clear. A young woman who had witnessed Eleanor Trevelyan's destruction and approved of it. Someone with access to both pharmaceutical knowledge and the psychological insight needed to orchestrate such an elaborate murder. Most tellingly, someone who watched the symbols of her victim's torment with the satisfaction of an artist admiring her own work. The candle that had burned long after midnight was indeed revealing its secrets, but not in the way Mrs. Armitage had hoped. Instead, it was illuminating the presence of a killer who had waited 20 years for the perfect moment to complete a revenge that had begun with Eleanor Trevelyan's disgrace and would end only when everyone connected to that original injustice had paid the price. Tomorrow, Miss Marple knew, would bring the final confrontation. The murderer's pride in her cleverness was becoming impossible to conceal, and pride in her long experience was always a killer's ultimate undoing. The morning brought Inspector Craddock to Miss Marple's cottage with evidence that would finally illuminate the darkest corners of their investigation. His expression carried both satisfaction and deep unease as he settled into the familiar chair by the window, a manila envelope resting in his lap. We've recovered the missing photograph from Ivy Cottage, he announced, producing a partially burned image from the envelope. Found in the vicarage fireplace, along with fragments of old correspondence. Mrs. Clement claimed she was simply clearing accumulated papers, but the timing is extraordinarily convenient. Miss Marple examined the damaged photograph through her reading glasses, noting the faces that remained visible despite the fire damage. A group of young women at what appears to be a London house party, circa 1932. And this face here, she indicated a figure whose features bore an unmistakable resemblance to their current suspect. Before Craddock could respond, Dr. Haydock arrived with laboratory results that provided the final piece of their puzzle. I've traced the pharmaceutical connection, he announced, accepting tea with distracted gratitude. Grace Clement worked as a pharmacist's assistant in London from 1933 to 1938, employed by the same chemist who supplied medications to the household where Eleanor Trevelyan was governess. More significantly, she had access to concentrated digitalin preparations that went missing after her employer's death. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as the pattern finally completed itself in her mind. So our Mrs. Clement has been carrying the means of murder for more than 20 years, waiting for the perfect victim and the perfect moment. The final confrontation. Rather than arrange a formal gathering, Miss Marple decided upon a more subtle approach. She invited Griselda for what appeared to be a casual afternoon visit, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the harvest festival. Inspector Craddock positioned himself discreetly in the garden, while Sergeant Fletcher waited just outside the drawing-room door. Griselda arrived with her usual brisk efficiency, carrying a basket of late roses from the vicarage garden. Her manner was perfectly composed, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tension around her eyes, the look of someone maintaining control through considerable effort. "I thought you might enjoy these," Griselda said, arranging the flowers with practiced skill. "Though I must say all the speculation about poor Lydia's death is becoming rather morbid. Surely it's time we focused on more pleasant matters." Miss Marple observed her visitor with mild blue eyes that missed nothing of significance. "Sometimes, my dear, the past refuses to stay buried." Mrs. Armitage certainly discovered that truth. Her conscience simply wouldn't allow her to rest. "Conscience can be such an inconvenient burden," Griselda replied, her tone light but carefully controlled. Poor Lydia was always rather dramatic. That midnight vigil of hers, it was almost theatrical, don't you think? Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, she was simply seeking forgiveness for a 20-year-old failure of courage. She was writing letters, you know, letters naming everyone who had witnessed Eleanor Trevelyan's disgrace, including a young relative named Grace, who was quite vocal in her condemnation of the governess. Griselda's hands paused among the roses, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "People often say dramatic things when they're frightened or guilty, Miss Marple. Who knows what fantasies poor Lydia might have constructed in her final days?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting with deliberate calm. "And yet someone took those fantasies seriously enough to ensure she never completed her vigil. Someone who understood exactly which candle she would choose and how to make it burn at twice the intended rate. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge who knew that Mrs. Armitage's heart condition made her vulnerable to certain concentrated preparations." The revelation. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes charged with dangerous electricity. Griselda turned slowly from the flowers, her composure beginning to show hairline cracks. "You have quite an imagination for someone of your years, Miss Marple," she said, though her voice had lost its warmth. "One should be careful about making accusations without substantial proof." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple replied with deceptive mildness. "Which is why Inspector Craddock has been examining the dispensary records from a certain London pharmacy where you worked as Grace Meredith, and why Dr. Haydock is currently analysing traces of candle wax found in your garden shed. Traces that, I believe, will match the accelerants used to tamper with Mrs. Armitage's vigil candle." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Griselda remained perfectly still. Then something fundamental shifted in her expression, the careful mask of the vicar's wife dissolving, to reveal something much colder and more calculating beneath. "Clever," she said softly, though her tone now carried genuine menace. "Very clever indeed. But cleverness requires proof that will stand in court, Miss Marple, and I've been extraordinarily careful about such details." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, though her eyes had sharpened with complete attention. "You were indeed careful, my dear. The candle purchased at a public auction, the digitalin added to her tea caddy during one of your many charitable visits, the blackmail letters designed to establish financial motive. All very sophisticated. Perhaps too sophisticated for someone supposedly uninvolved in the original scandal." "The original scandal," Griselda repeated, her voice taking on a bitter edge. "You mean Eleanor Trevelyan's pathetic attempt to seduce a man above her station, her manipulation of a household sympathy until everyone forgot she was merely a servant with pretensions. The words hung in the air like a confession, revealing depths of resentment that had festered for decades. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded her visitor with infinite sadness. "So, you admit you knew Eleanor Trevelyan personally?" Griselda laughed, though the sound held no humour whatsoever. "I was engaged to marry Charles Harrington until that scheming governess caught his eye with her false innocence and literary pretensions. She destroyed my future as surely as if she had put a knife through my heart." The confession, but Eleanor never encouraged his attentions, Miss Marple said gently. According to all accounts, she rejected his advances and maintained proper professional boundaries. She encouraged him simply by existing, Griselda snapped, her careful composure finally cracking completely. By being beautiful and educated, and making the rest of us seem ordinary by comparison. When the theft accusations arose, I made certain everyone understood what sort of woman she really was. Lydia Armitage was simply too cowardly to speak the truth. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, recognizing the moment when long-suppressed truth finally breaks free. And when Mrs. Armitage decided to make amends by confessing her silence and providing for Eleanor's daughter, you saw it as a threat to the version of events you had spent 20 years constructing. She was going to ruin everything, Griselda said, her voice low and venomous, paint herself as the repentant sinner and Eleanor as the innocent victim. Make me appear as the vindictive girl who destroyed an angel through jealousy. I couldn't allow such revisionist sentimentality to stand. The confession continued to pour forth, 20 years of carefully contained hatred finally finding expression. Griselda detailed how she had recognized Nell Trevelyan's resemblance to her mother, how she had cultivated Mrs. Armitage's guilt while secretly planning her destruction, how she had used her pharmaceutical knowledge to prepare both the poison and the candle modifications that would ensure perfect timing. The beauty of it, she said with chilling pride, was that she died exactly as she deserved, consumed by her own guilt, watching her protection burn away hour by hour, knowing that her cowardice had finally caught up with her. Justice and reflection. As Inspector Craddock entered to make the formal arrest, Griselda's demeanour shifted once more, the calculating intelligence reasserting itself. She straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and faced the inevitable consequences with the same cold composure she had maintained for 2 decades. "You think you've achieved justice," she said to Miss Marple as the handcuffs clicked into place, "but you cannot bring them back. Eleanor, Lydia, even poor Charles, who died in the war, still believing Eleanor had betrayed his trust. The damage was done 20 years ago. I simply completed the pattern." Miss Marple watched with profound sadness as they led her away. The mystery was solved, the killer revealed, but the victory felt hollow, as it always did when human wickedness was finally exposed to the light. Standing alone in her drawing room, surrounded by the scattered roses that Griselda had arranged with such care, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible patience of evil. The candle that had burned long after midnight had indeed revealed its secrets, but those secrets spoke only of wasted lives and the corrosive power of resentment nursed across decades. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed their own suffering justified any cruelty, who saw other people not as fellow human beings but as obstacles to be removed or instruments to be used. Griselda Clement had spent 20 years perfecting her revenge, turning herself into a weapon aimed at anyone who threatened her carefully constructed version of the past. As evening approached and the roses began to wilt in their vase, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with hands that trembled only slightly. The pattern was complete, the threads finally woven into their proper places, but the design they revealed spoke only of darkness and the terrible price of allowing hatred to burn like a candle long after midnight. The weeks following Griselda Clement's arrest brought a peculiar quality to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The familiar rhythms continued. Milk bottles appeared on doorsteps, the church bells rang their ancient pattern. Mrs. Butt still arrived punctually at various cottages with her cleaning supplies. Yet beneath these comfortable routines ran an undercurrent of unease that would take months to fully dissipate. The trial and its aftermath, the legal proceedings unfolded with the methodical efficiency characteristic of English justice. Grace Meredith Clement, for that proved to be her legal name, faced charges of murder with malice aforethought, and the evidence assembled by Inspector Craddock proved overwhelming. The prosecution painted a meticulous portrait of calculated revenge spanning 2 decades. Pharmaceutical records documenting her access to concentrated digitalin preparations, chemical analysis matching candle tampering materials to substances found in the vicarage shed, and most damning of all, her own detailed confession witnessed by Miss Marple and the concealed officers. The defence attempted to argue temporary insanity brought on by the resurfacing of old trauma, but the elaborate planning evident in every aspect of the crime undermined such claims. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning their verdict. Grace received a sentence of life imprisonment, though few expected her to survive long in confinement. Women of her temperament, accustomed to control and performance, rarely adapted well to the restrictions of prison life. Miss Marple attended the trial only once, sitting quietly in the public gallery as medical experts detailed the sophisticated knowledge required for both the poison and the candle tampering. She observed Grace throughout the proceedings, noting how the woman maintained her composure even as the full extent of her crimes was laid bare. There was no remorse in those intelligent eyes, only a kind of cold satisfaction that her cleverness had finally been recognized, even if it meant her destruction. The scattering of lives. The Reverend Leonard Clement resigned his position within a fortnight of his wife's conviction, broken by the revelation of her true nature. He had been genuinely ignorant of her past and her crimes, a fact that somehow made his suffering more poignant. That village watched with quiet sympathy as he packed his modest belongings and departed for a small parish in Scotland, where his name carried no associations with murder. Mrs. Price Ridley left St. Mary Mead shortly after the trial, unable to face the villagers' knowledge of her own role in Eleanor's destruction. Her departure was marked by neither ceremony nor regret. She simply vanished one morning, leaving her cottage to be sold by solicitors, and her reputation to be dissected by those she had once judged so harshly. Hugh Denham weathered the scandal with quiet dignity, his professional reputation intact despite his peripheral involvement in the case. He remained with Mr. Petherick's firm, though he was notably more cautious about the company he kept and the confidences he accepted. Nell Trevelyan lingered in the village longer than anyone had expected. The codicil to Mrs. Armitage's will had been upheld, and she used the £500 to establish a small scholarship fund for young women in difficult circumstances. She visited her mother's grave regularly, placing fresh flowers on the simple headstone and speaking quietly to the woman she had never truly known. One afternoon, she came to Miss Marple's cottage for what both understood would be a farewell tea. Her fashionable London clothes had been exchanged for simpler attire that suggested she had found a measure of peace. "I wanted to thank you," she said, accepting a cup of Earl Grey with hands that no longer trembled. "Not just for solving the murder, but for understanding that my mother deserved justice, even after all these years. Grace Clement destroyed her as surely as if she had administered poison directly." Miss Marple regarded the young woman with gentle sympathy. "Your mother's tragedy was that she became a symbol rather than a person, a repository for others' jealousies and fears. None of them truly saw Eleanor Trevelyan herself. But Mrs. Armitage did leave you something besides money and guilt. She left you the knowledge that you come from people worth remembering. The village remembers and forgets. As autumn deepened into winter, St. Mary Mead gradually returned to its customary rhythms, though the scandal had left permanent marks on the village's social fabric. The grocer's wife declared it proof that you never know what lies behind a cheerful face. while Miss Hartnell sniffed that there had always been something theatrical about Mrs. Clement. Major Burnaby, with military bluntness, pronounced the whole affair what comes of too much cleverness and not enough character. Yet, for all their gossip and theories, the villagers were fundamentally kind-hearted people who understood that tragedy could strike any household. They rallied around their new vicar when he arrived from Devon, a gentle man who asked no questions about his predecessor and devoted himself to healing the parish's wounded spirit. Miss Marple's final reflection. On Christmas Eve, as candles burned in every window of St. Mary Mead, symbols of hope and light against the winter darkness, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reflecting on the case that had consumed so many weeks of autumn. The midnight vigil candle had indeed illuminated secrets, though not in the way its creator had intended. It had revealed the corrosive power of resentment, the terrible patience of evil, and the ways that past injustices could poison present lives across decades. She thought often of Mrs. Armitage sitting in her study, watching the candle burn, and believing she had 36 hours of safety, when in reality her time was already measured and finite. There was something profoundly tragic about that image, a woman seeking redemption while her murderer's poison already worked through her system, her symbol of hope transformed into a timer counting down to death. Dr. Haydock, who had become a regular visitor for tea and conversation about human nature, posed a question that had been troubling him. Do you think she ever truly loved anyone, Miss Marple? Or was her entire life simply a performance designed to facilitate revenge? Miss Marple considered this carefully, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. I believe she loved Charles Harrington in her own fashion, though it was a possessive, demanding sort of love that saw him as property rather than person. When Eleanor threatened that possession, Grace couldn't forgive either of them. Her subsequent marriage to Leonard Clement was purely strategic, a means of positioning herself for eventual revenge. She paused to adjust her wool. Patience is not always a virtue, Doctor. When combined with hatred and a sense of grievance, it becomes something quite monstrous. Grace convinced herself that her suffering justified any cruelty, that her pain gave her the right to judge and execute others. She built everything around a grievance, and people who do that seldom notice when they themselves become the cruel ones. The enduring light. As the first snow of winter began to fall outside her window, Miss Marple reflected that even the most elaborate deceptions eventually revealed themselves. Grace Clement had been extraordinarily clever, patient, and thorough in her planning. But she had made the fundamental error that all murderers eventually make. She had underestimated the power of truth to surface, like cream and milk, no matter how carefully it had been concealed. The case had also revealed the complex nature of guilt and responsibility. Mrs. Armitage had been complicit in Eleanor's destruction through her silence, yet she had ultimately tried to make amends. Mrs. Price Ridley had actively encouraged the persecution, yet she had also suffered genuine remorse. Grace alone had felt no guilt, only satisfaction at having orchestrated such an elaborate revenge. Setting aside her knitting, Miss Marple moved to her window and lit a small candle, more from habit than necessity. The flame steadied, modest and unremarkable. It would burn, she knew, neither longer nor shorter than its honest length allowed. There was comfort in that simple reliability. Human lives, she reflected, might not be so exact, but perhaps one could at least try to ensure that what time remained was not wasted in feeding resentments that, left unchecked, could one day demand blood. The candle that burned long after midnight had finally guttered out, its secrets exposed to the light of day. Justice had been served, though imperfectly and at terrible cost. And Miss Marple, sitting by her own modest flame with her knitting in her lap, understood that this was often the best that could be hoped for in a world where human nature remained as complex, contradictory, and occasionally monstrous as it had always been. Outside, the village settled into sleep under its blanket of snow. Somewhere, a dog barked once and was still. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and winter roses. Tomorrow there would be Christmas services and Boxing Day visits, and life would continue in St. Mary Mead, as it always did and always would, under the watchful, unassuming eye of an elderly lady who saw more than most and said only just enough.